Hey art nerds, today we are field testing the Bauhang Academy watercolor pad. You guys saw me review this in like a dual watercolor pad review a while back when I was looking at the Durer Art watercolor round. You can get these on AliExpress anywhere from like $7.78 to about $30 depending on what size you order. They're available in fine grain, medium grain, and coarse grain, and we're looking at the medium grain today. So I guess that would be similar to a cold press that we might see over here. This is a 140-pound paper or 300 GSM, and spoiler, once I removed it from the block, it's a bit thinner than I'm used to for a 140-pound paper. But like I said, I didn't realize how thin it was until I removed it from the block. So in the initial test, it seemed very promising, but I didn't want to tell you guys to go ahead and buy it until I had a chance to really field test it myself. So today we're going to not today, over the span of many weeks, this is narrated in post, we are going to ink this using a brush, which I'll demonstrate here, and then we're going to watercolor on top of it. And if you guys hear the train in the background, it is because I literally live a block away from 2 sets of train tracks, and that's just how it is. So I ordered one of the smaller blocks from AliExpress a while back. It took about a month to arrive, so if you're in the US and you want to try this paper, I would say the price is definitely worth it. Just be patient and give it plenty of time to come in. And if you think you're going to fall in love with this paper, maybe order 2 blocks. There are 20 sheets in the pad though, so it should last you a while. So for today's inking, I am using a Winsor Newton Series 7 size 2 brush that has never been used for watercolor, only for inking. I'm using some Dinky Dips that I purchased from Paper and Ink Arts a while back, and I've talked about those a lot on this channel. They are just little paint, fountain pen, or ink pots, and you put them in the wooden block that you have here. They have fancier designs as well, but I don't really need fancy. And they hold your little paint pot steady while you ink or while you paint. So it's a great way to not waste a lot of ink and not spill ink all over the place. I remember when I was in grad school, 2 of my friends were taking the advanced inking techniques class, and we were all hanging out at another friend's house. And this friend has a cat, and I have a cat too, but their cat was much more nosy about people things than my cat is. And their cat got into the other friend's ink water when that friend went to use the bathroom and spilled the ink water all over the piece they were in the middle of inking before we could stop the cat. I mean, it happened in a split second. With Dinky Dips, at least you don't have to worry about the ink getting spilled all over the place. And that's also why I'm using a very squat, sort of heavy ceramic ramekin for my inking water. Means cats can't spill it all over the place. I don't need to have something happen to me for me to learn a lesson. Now, if you're interested in inking with a brush, I highly recommend it. I do enjoy doing it, and I do try to do it from time to time. One of the reasons I don't do it so often is because it can be kind of time intensive for me, and also it can be kind of messy. As you can see, I have to have a lot of equipment out just to ink, whereas if I was inking with brush pens, I really just need the brush pens to ink. But if you're interested in learning more about traditional brush inking, I've got a lot of great videos on how to do that here on the channel. I'll try to sprinkle those throughout this video as well as down in the description below. But for me, now that I have some practice doing it, it's definitely one of those things that you need to practice to get good at it. Don't expect it to be great the first time you do it. I know YouTube kind of creates this idea that with some of the artists on here, like the first time I do it, I'm just naturally wonderful. But really, if you want to learn how to ink with a brush, give yourself time to practice, be patient with yourself, and try and try and try again. It takes a lot of time to get good at this. Some people are just naturally good at things, and some of us have to work hard to get good at things. I'm one of the ones who has to really work for it. So I'm also one of the ones who will really encourage you guys to put the time in to practice and to be patient and kind with yourself. So I realize most people who are watching this video are probably not planning on using a brush to ink on this paper, but I'm going to talk to you guys about it anyway. The paper took the ink fairly well. I've never really had problems with cotton rag papers and doing brush inking on top of them. I'm sure if I did it on like a Shizen cold press with like the really pronounced texture, I might have a different tale to tell, but this is I would say there's an assertive texture to it. It has a texture a bit like sandpaper. There's a lot of gelatin or sizing in it, but it's not a difficult paper. It's a little more mild-mannered than, say, Arches in regards to inking. So I didn't have a whole lot of problems with dry brushing, and I didn't have to charge the brush too much. The only real issue I felt like I had is because this is a block of watercolor paper, and it's a fairly thick block, my wrist kept wanting to pivot off of the pad while I was inking, so I didn't really have a good support system in place, if you know what I mean, to rest my wrist or to rest my arm, since there is that difference. So if you want to ink on this and you don't mind re-stretching it later, I would recommend removing it from the block first. I mean, if you want to print like blue lines onto it using your printer and then ink on top of it, you'd have to remove it from the block anyway. I guess something else you could do is you could, and I'm stealing this idea from a manga I was reading, Yoshi no Zuotara, where they make like a false book to go under the book's cover, so when he's signing books it doesn't wreck the cover, and I'm like, oh, that's genius. So that's probably what I'm thinking about, where you could build like a little fort around your watercolor pad so that you could more easily ink and you can make it modular. Now the only problem with that is that as your pad goes down, as you use up the sheets of paper, your fort's going to stay the same size, but your block is going to change. So maybe that solution is not the best solution after all. So I've talked about several watercolor papers here on the channel and over on the Natto Soup Studio blog over the years, and I really just enjoy cotton rag paper in general. I like it on block, I like it off the block, I'll use it on the block, I'll use it off the block. For me, because I do so many different types of watercolor, I have use for all of them, and it also gives me a chance to kind of experiment and play around more. But if you are looking for good watercolor paper, there's a lot of very affordable options on the market, this one included. I will say the larger size, being around $30, that's pretty comparable to what you would pay in the US for similar size pads. I think the Hahnemühle Cezanne is a similar price point depending on where you get it. You can get the big Blick Studio cotton rag watercolor blocks, which I actually really like and I really recommend. I talked about them in a gift guide in 2018. I think you can get those for a little bit less than $30, the larger sizes. Even Arches, you can get that at about the same price. So this is not necessarily the cheapest cotton rag watercolor paper on the market. It's not the most expensive, but it's not like, wow, such bargain, must order. Like some things from AliExpress, it's pretty competitively priced with what you can get in the US. Now, if you are fortunate enough to see this in your local shops, in fact, someone in the paint box was saying they can buy it at their local art supply store, then it is a really good, I don't want to spoil my own review. I'd like you guys to watch to the end, please. But I also want to talk about the paper, and I want to talk about the attributes of this paper, so bear with me. Anyway, if you do see it locally, it is competitive with some of the other US papers you can find. I cannot speak to every country because for the most part I've only ever lived in the US. I've been to Germany and I've been to Japan, but I was only there for a short period of time. So it's not like I really experienced what it's like to buy there and what's accessible and available there. So you guys could definitely let me know in the comments what brands are available where you live. And that would actually help me with these reviews a lot, because I do get complaints when people are like, you only talk about US based stuff. And it's like, well, yes, because I live in the US. So if you are kind of frustrated by that, I by all means encourage you to either chat with me over on the Paintbox, my art-centric server, and talk to me about where you live and what's available where you live and what's common where you live, so I have a basis of comparison. Or you can start your own reviews, your own blog, your own channel, where you talk about it from your unique viewpoint and add to the conversation. Because US-based artists, we're just doing the best we can. You know, some of us don't make enough money off of YouTube to be able to travel to other countries to talk about their art supplies. I mean, I think that would be a dream for a lot of us. And when I am in other places for other reasons, I always try to make it a point to talk about the art supplies if I'm able. But I can't afford to just go to a country to check out their art supplies. Like, I'd really like to visit Hong Kong at some point and South Korea at some point to talk about the art and talk about the art supplies. But that's not something that's financially viable for me. But I would love to learn more about the traditional art cultures in both of those countries, because that information is not always available when you live in the rural US. So I encourage you guys, if you're interested in that, please consider doing it. Anyway, I have finished inking this piece. I used FW acrylic ink for this so that I could watercolor on top of it. I let it dry for way more than 24 hours, more like several weeks, because life got busy. And in fact, it wasn't until someone asked me in the Paintbox, like, hey, whatever happened with that Bao Hang watercolor paper, that I was like, shoot, let me finish that review. So this one's for you. You know who you are. So to paint this, I'm going to use my Daily Driver watercolor palette. You guys have seen this palette a lot on this channel. It contains loads of different professional watercolor paints. I've kind of curated my favorites from all the reviews that I've done over the years. And speaking of Dinky Dips, going back, I actually put some masking fluid in a Dinky Dip cup. And I find this works really well for me, because it means that the masking fluid doesn't spoil as quickly and I'm not working with as much. And I can also leave it uncapped without worrying about ruining the whole batch. And I'm using Winsor & Newton's dyed removable masking fluid, so dyed so that I can actually see it, although it's such a light yellow and I paint a lot of foliage that it gets lost anyway. And removable because they do make permanent masking fluid. I don't know why. Wouldn't you do a wax resist for that? I don't even know. But removable so I can remove it later. And I'm doing a flicking technique here because I wanted to create an illustration where we have like ladybugs and dewdrops just kind of like exploding from the foliage as like Kara breaks through. And this might look actually it does look very similar to the piece I did to test out the Cambio Tambien brush pins. You know, I had a lot of fun painting that piece. I started this piece before that piece, but I finished this piece after that piece. And there was a lot that I wanted to do differently for this piece after painting that piece. So another thing is I wanted to see if different sizes of salt created different kinds of crystals. Now usually I use kosher salt when I'm doing a salt technique because it gives you these really large, nice snowflake sort of patterns. And I thought Himalayan rock salt might give me even bigger blooms. It does not. It is not impressive at all. Maybe I should have ground it up finer. I don't know, but it caused more problems than it really solved. So if you're looking for a good salt for salt techniques, my personal favorite is just plain old kosher salt. So once that dried and I removed the salt rocks, I'm going in and I'm masking some of my ladybugs using the masking fluid, of course, and I just wanted to kind of like tone the piece. Now, I avoided toning her face too much because I find that this is a really beautiful blue. I think it's, it might be Magello Marine Blue, and it just can desaturate skin a little bit too much, and I wanted her face to kind of pop out of the foliage. So I just used a paper towel to kind of lift that back up while it was still wet. So the paper dries reasonably quickly. It's about on par with other cotton rag blocks of the same size. And fortunately, all four sides are glued. So even though I put on a lot of water, a lot of washes, as you can see here, while there might have been a little bit of slight buckling, it dried flat and there was no real kipping or distortion. So you're not going to necessarily have problems with water pooling or water control on this paper so long as you leave it on the block. Now I am in Southeast Louisiana and has been a very rainy weekend, and my dehumidifier has been running full blast all weekend. So there were periods of time where I'd really saturated the paper and it took much longer to dry. I think that's just because the atmospheric humidity here in Louisiana was so high that there was nowhere for the water to go. So your mileage may vary in that regard. I just wanted to mention it, you know, in terms of fairness and honesty. So as I mentioned earlier, the paper has a fairly assertive texture. The cold press isn't as pronounced as, say, Shizen, but there seems to be a lot of sizing in the paper. So texture is a bit like sandpaper. I think this paper would be great for more gestural watercolors or dry brush effects. You get this really nice speckling. And I know some plein air artists, particularly people who paint a lot of water, are looking for that effect as well. This paper is going to be able to deliver that for you guys. So I did a bit of underpainting with the blue here. And this is a technique that I really like when I'm painting foliage, because I can get some really nice, fresh, bright greens by allowing the paint to mix optically in your eyes. So I used a lot of the marine blue, and now I'm introducing a little bit of Winsor & Newton's indigo just to further reinforce some of those shadows. So this is a bit like a grisé technique, except more of like an azurel, maybe? My French is pretty terrible. So now I'm using a cool, more opaque yellow. It's a Sennelier yellow. It might be their Azo yellow. It's probably their bismuth yellow. And I'm just glazing on top of the leaves. So we're going to get this really bright, fresh, optical green. And I've found that when I paint foliage using this technique, it feels a lot fresher and a lot brighter than if I were to pre-mix my green, or if I was to use, say, a Hooker's green for this. And I'm just using a Post-it note for some quick and easy masking for these sort of splatter techniques. It's really just to protect your face from getting all of these splatters early on. So for Kara's skin, I mixed up my yellow ochre with scarlet for her skin. And I actually have some really good tutorials on mixing up different skin tones for watercolor. I'm usually a watercolor comic artist. That's the main body of my work and the main focus of my watercolor. That's why I watercolor, is because I love watercolor comics and I love painting watercolor comics, so this is in service to that. And speaking of watercolor comics, this is Kara, if you don't know her yet, from my comic 7-inch Kara, the watercolor comic I was just telling you guys about. And it's an all-ages comic about a 7-inch tall girl exploring the great big world outside of her forgotten dollhouse. You can read the first 7 chapters for free at 7inchkara.com. And we semi-recently, we kickstarted volume 2 in June. It was successfully kickstarted, and now we're in the middle of the printing process at the time of recording. I've been sharing a lot of behind the scenes layout and printing and merchandising stuff over on a Patreon and Kickstarter exclusive blog. Now, it's too late to back the Kickstarter now, although it is not too late to pre-order your own copy of 7-inch Kara Volume 2, which you can find on my shop. I'll link that down in the description below. But if you'd like access to the blog, you can join me on Patreon. Help support more reviews and tutorials like this one at patreon.com/natosoup. So at this point, I wanted to add a little bit more depth to the leaves, so I'm painting in with a thicker mix of the indigo. And I want to point out about this paper is there was a point where I kind of forgot I was doing a field test, in that I just kind of enjoyed painting this piece and painting on this paper. And to me, that's one of the signs of a paper that I'm going to use often, a paper I'm going to reach for when I want to just paint whatever and not have to think about working with it. It's not a specialty use paper for me, and it doesn't become one of those papers I hoard and always want to use but never use. Like I've got a bunch of mulberry paper that I'm just hoarding because I'm waiting for the day I'm going to use it. I feel like this is a paper that could be a good everyday paper, especially if you can find it locally. So when I forgot, or the points where I just kind of fell into painting and I forgot that this was a field test, that's a good sign. That is a sign of a paper that I enjoy using and I'm going to continue using. I also didn't have a lot of notes about this paper for the same reason. It's a fairly decent cotton rag watercolor paper. I like it better than the Fluid 100. Although I do like Fluid 100, it's a little too mild-mannered for me, to be frank. I would put it on par with the Blick Studio cotton rag paper, which I like a lot and I use pretty often, and I use it quite frequently when I'm creating demos for like YouTube because it's a very affordable cotton rag paper. And in a way, it's similar to this paper in that I have to order it from Blick. I can't buy it in stores. I don't live near a Blick. So like the Bauhang or Bauhang watercolor paper, I have to order it and then wait. So for me, they're about on par. But if you live near a Blick, you know, you can go and buy the blocks yourself. So I went ahead and I added some blush using alizarin crimson to her cheeks and above her eyes and her lips and the palms of her hands. And now I'm removing some of the masking fluid, not all, but just some, with a masking fluid pickup. Now I know some people use their fingers for that. I think I just have, my hands are just too dry because I have no luck with that whatsoever. But masking fluid pickups allow me to keep my paper fairly clean. I do have to peel off the masking, like the built up masking fluid, so I can get a clean edge, but that's not really a big deal. And it allows me to cleanly lift up my masking fluid without tearing my paper and without like removing pigments or anything like that. And even for those small speckles, I can just kind of gently run it across the paper, not like dig in like you might with an eraser, but just gently brush it because it's kind of like a masking fluid magnet. Masking fluid wants to stick to it, so you don't have to fight with it too much. So now that I have the leaves mostly painted in, I can start working on the ladybugs. So for the ladybugs more in the background, I'm using a cooler red. I'm using Holbein's Cherry Red, which is a quinacridone red, so it's a bluer red. And then for the ladybugs closer to us in the foreground, closer to Kara, I'm using a scarlet red, which is a warmer red, and that's going to make them seem like they're closer to us. So I was trying to create a little bit of atmospheric perspective, even though there's not a whole lot of foreground, middle ground, and background in this piece. So once this paper is saturated, it takes a while to dry out. So, and again, I'm in Southeast Louisiana. It's very humid. It's very rainy. But I also know that I have friends who live in South America where, oh, the conditions are very similar. Or they live in parts of Asia where, oh, the conditions are very similar. So it's worth mentioning, not everybody lives in the dry. Some of us live in the swamp. And so I am just kind of giving you that information for my fellow swamp friends, my fellow froggy friends. So for her shirt, I wanted to go with yellow. Now, normally I would go with like a really contrasty color, kind of like in the Cambio Tambien piece where I used like a magenta and then I painted a surface pattern on it. But for this, I wanted her face to really be more of the eye catch, the face and the ladybug. So I went with a warm yellow for her shirt. So it's a little bit of contrast in that it is a warmer yellow, a warmer color amongst a sea of cooler colors, but it's still a yellow and it still kind of blends in. Now, I find that this paper is really great for sedimenting paints. The bismuth yellow, if you guys remember way back before I did all the indigo layers, it was actually kind of occluding, covering up the line art that I originally painted, which was kind of an interesting effect. It wasn't the effect I wanted, but you might like that. You might find it really useful for doing like fogs or for doing mists. But sedimenting pigments seem to really like this paper. There's enough tooth to it that they can kind of sediment out into the cracks, but it's not so much tooth that it starts looking dirty or muddy. And this paper also handles masking fluid really well, both the application and removal. I found that like Shizen, for example, I've had bad experiences with Shizen and masking fluid to the point where it just tears all the surface off. But I had no tearing issues whatsoever on this paper using masking fluid. And when I spritz water, and I did that just to kind of get some of the pigments moving, to get some more liveliness going, to get some of the colors mixing into the masked off areas. And it's one of my tricks for dewdrops, and that's why my dewdrops look better. I mean, they look pretty good, I think, but they don't take a whole lot of effort, and that's because I will re-wet the paper and allow the pigments to kind of mix into those reserved areas. The colors don't reactivate as much as they did on the Fluid Easy block that I did the Cambio Tambien piece, and that's a cellulose paper, and I find that pigments kind of adhere to cotton rag papers like this one better than they adhere to cellulose papers. They just sort of sit on the surface of cellulose papers, so you can't do as much with them, whereas with cotton rag papers, I feel like they kind of soak in and lock into those fibers. So on this paper, I didn't get as much movement or as much reactivity, which is good. I wasn't looking for a lot of movement. I was just looking for a little bit. So it's easier to control. So this could be a good paper for you if you like to use a lot of watercolor glazes, if you do thin washes of color on top of existing layers of color. Now, ladybugs have a black body under those bright red carapace, that bright red shell. I don't want to say the wings because their wings are black and gauzy and they're like hidden under the bright red something. I'm sure one of you guys will be able to tell me down in the comments below. I'm sorry, I'm not really an insect person. Anyway, they have black bodies underneath, and I didn't want to go just like straight like lamp black. So I went with a Van Dyke brown, and then later I'm going to apply a Payne's gray, and then I'm going to go with black. And you guys see me using Post-it notes as a cheap, easy mask pretty frequently. You might want to avoid bright pink like this. I was really living quite dangerously because you never really know the dye they're using in these kinds of things, and it might be reactivated with water. But since I was just doing like a light spray and a light mist, it wasn't really that big a deal. I also use my hand to kind of shield and block areas that I want to protect. Doesn't look so good on camera, I know. And it's actually kind of challenging to do on camera because I'm working around the camera and my camera's charging cable as I'm spraying. But it doesn't result in bleeding. Okay, so for the dewdrops, I am applying a little bit of bismuth yellow first because I want to kind of reflect the sunlight. And I'm picking up some of that additional, or some of the residual, there we go, masking fluid from the block. And then I'm going in with just a little bit of really watered down indigo mixed with the marine blue. And I end up just kind of switching over to really watered down marine blue later because the indigo is a little bit darker and muddier than what I was really looking for. And I use that on the bottom halves of the dewdrops to paint in the shadows. But at this point, I am applying the Payne's Gray to the bodies of the ladybugs instead. See, this is what I kind of mean about, like, it was taking a long time for it to dry for me. And, I mean, to be fair, I just sprayed a bunch of water on it, so, you know, duh, Becca. But usually on some papers that dry a bit faster, and I do find that block-bound papers dry slower than papers I've stretched on corrugated plastic, maybe because the water can really seep in a bit more. So there are areas, I kind of wait for areas to dry so I work around them. So for example, I'm applying Karis Freckles using just a little bit of Venetian red. So Kara has reddish brown hair, and since she's in shadow here, I'm going to darken it using Van Dyke Red. But I want to leave some rim lighting, and I definitely want to leave at least the front of the bangs catching the light. So basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to kind of capture the idea that she's hiding in the leaves or coming out from within the leaves. And unusually for me, I actually did not use a red-violet based shadow on her skin. Instead, I used the marine blue just to further convey the like coming out of the cool, darkish foliage. So now I'm kind of going back into the dewdrops and adding a little bit more shadow. One of the other tricks I find, I mean, if you were painting a single macro scale, i.e. enlarged dewdrop, you would definitely want to add in a lot more detail. But you guys see the size I'm painting dewdrops at. They're almost life size. They're very small, and in general when I paint dewdrops they're very small. So you don't really want a whole lot going on. Basically you want maybe your base color, which would be a simplified version of the local color. So whatever the dewdrop is sitting on, a simplified lighter version of that, so maybe one of your earlier stage colors. Then you might want to put in like the lighting color or a highlight color. So if it's sunlight, you might want to go with yellow, and then you might want to do a shadow color or a contrast color down at the bottom. And then later on, you might want to apply just a little bit of like white gouache for like the specular highlights, the really high key highlights. But I find that I'm most successful with dewdrops when I keep them pretty simple. The same should probably be said for the splatter effects, but what I was really trying to convey here was this sense of movement out of the leaves, like like the ladybugs are just exploding out of the leaves. Like you see with birds when like a large animal runs through like the bushes and the bush just like explodes with birds, something kind of similar to that. So you can see with the masking fluid or pickup or the masking fluid eraser, I'm just barely touching it to the paper. I'm not really scrubbing with it. And I wanted to get some more like background color movement into Kara's arms. So I spritzed just to get some of the indigo blue kind of moving into her hands and also create a little bit more chaos. So in the past, I've kind of gotten to the point where I often feel like my watercolor art is a little bit too color by numbers. So I will use things like salt, or I'll use things like lifting techniques or sedimenting colors, or spritzing water or spray techniques just to kind of loosen things up and get the color moving a little bit so it's a little bit less static. So now that I've finished the watercolor portion of this, it's time for the watercolor pencils, and I'm using some of my favorites, the Derwent Inktense pencils. And I want to point out that you guys need to let your paper dry fully with this. I mean, you could apply watercolor pencil while still wet. It's going to give you a different effect, but this paper has a decent texture for watercolor pencils, but it was still a little soggy, still a little damp, so I wasn't really having much success with watercolor pencils on this paper because I wasn't patient enough. But if you let it dry fully, the paper has an assertive enough texture that watercolor pencils should play really nicely on this paper. And if you're using gouache, which I'm about to introduce in a second here, you may want to work with a little bit more water just to avoid dry brushing and to increase your control. Because like I said, this paper has a fairly assertive texture. And I've found that on very mild-mannered papers like, let's say, Bristol, I work more thickly with gouache. But on more assertive papers, you need more liquid in there so that it actually hits all those little valleys. And since this is indeed a field test, it's important to talk about removing it from the block. I'm using a plain old palette knife here, and I found that it removes easily from the block as long as you run the palette knife around all 4 sides. Okay, so since this is a field test, it's time to talk about the verdict. What are the pros and cons of the Bao Heng Academy watercolor block? So the pros. It's a reasonably priced watercolor block on AliExpress, starting at about $7.78. Your price may vary. It's AliExpress at time of recording, etc., etc. I think it has a nice texture for cold press. I like cold press papers with assertive textures. I also like rough press, so this works for me. The block does a great job of holding the paper tight. There is no buckling or kipping on the block, which is really important. It takes layering really well, which is something else that's really important to me because you guys see I really slather on the layers when I paint with watercolor. I think it would be a good option for plein air watercolor paper because of all 3 of those reasons. And with 20 sheets per pad, I think you get a fair amount of paper for the price. So what about the cons? All right, if you order it from AliExpress, you're going to have to wait a while for it to arrive. That's just AliExpress. It's coming from China. If you end up loving this paper, you should stock up when you order because you won't be able to find it in brick and mortar stores in the US. Now, if you guys live in the US and you do actually see them out in the wild, let me know. I know sometimes smaller independent art stores carry interesting and unusual things, so this is definitely a your mileage may vary situation. You want to be careful when buying art supplies on AliExpress as knockoffs are pretty common, so read the reviews at the very least, and if you have friends who buy from AliExpress, ask them who their favorite vendors are. You can find the hot press version of this available on Amazon under the Meeden name, and I'll have a link to that down in the description below, as well as a Bao Heng pad that looks different from this one, but it might be the same. If you try it, let me know, and I'll link both of those down in the description below. So all in all, I like this watercolor pad. I think it is a good cotton rag pad. I think it is affordably priced, and I'd love to try some of the larger sizes. I may do that in the future. Since this is purchased entirely out of pocket, I'm kind of at a point where I got to use up what I have before I go and buy a whole bunch of new stuff, so it may take a long time before I get around to doing one of the larger pad reviews. But I had a enjoyable time. I enjoyed painting this illustration. I enjoyed using this paper. I kind of forgot myself, which is a really good thing. And I hope this was helpful, useful, and informative for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If you did, please do let me know down in the comments below. If there are other watercolor papers that you'd like to see me try, let me know that as well. I'll do my best to get a hold of them. But search my YouTube channel first to see if I've actually reviewed them, because I have reviewed quite a few papers here on the channel. So that wraps it up for the Bao Heng Academy watercolor pad. I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Bye guys!